very brief introduction and then ask you to tell us more about yourself, okay?
Yeah, sounds good. And then let me know if you can still see all the presentation, everything okay?
Okay, good. So welcome. Thank you, everybody, for being here. We have Katrina Leonoudakis, who is a localization producer with over 10 years of experience in subtitling and dubbing television and movie projects. She has an MA in translation from Kent State University, and her work has been showcased on Netflix, Hulu, Amazon Prime, Funimation, Crunchyroll, and she is passionate about translation theory and using applied linguistics to solve challenges in audiovisual translation. So let's welcome Katrina. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm super excited to be here. I'm glad that I get to talk about something I'm super passionate about. So yeah, we'll go ahead and dive really quickly into what we'll be talking about today. So first, I'm going to go over a little bit about my own career as an audiovisual localization specialist and producer. And then we'll talk a little bit about what audiovisual localization looks like today and how we can apply linguistic theory to help us with those challenges. So a little bit more about me. When I started off getting into translation, I was, very young. I was, really into anime. I watched a lot of Dragon Ball Z and Sailor Moon and whatnot. So that really got me into Japanese. I was fan translating a lot of comics online, like on Twitter and on the internet, like in forums in high school. I did a semester abroad in Japan, which is when I decided to switch my major from psychology to Japanese. And then I ended up after graduation doing about a year in Japan teaching English. Throughout that whole time, I was still kind of doing online fan translation, which gave me a lot of like a little bit of experience here and there that really prepared me for a career. I ended up going to Kent State, as I just mentioned, for my master's degree in translation. Part of this 2-year program took me through every kind of text type, from legal text to financial texts. We did a lot of medical translation, especially with Japanese, a lot of technical translation as well, some automotive translation. We did some training in computer-assisted translation, or CAT tools, as well as terminology management, which is highly important no matter what you're translating. But I think the most important part of that journey for me was it really sparked this passion for linguistic and translation theory. It's something that we don't think about a lot as translators, but it gives a lot of names and words for processes that we use on a day-to-day basis. And it was just really cool to me. They almost suckered me into a PhD, but I decided to end up going into the industry instead. I did a case study comparing 2 different speeches, which is specifically about surrogacy, which is illegal in Japan. So it was kind of an interesting view. And then I had to do a whole 40-page paper about why I translated it the way I did. I was lucky enough to be hired at Sentai Filmworks, which is an anime subtitling company, directly after basically right before I graduated Kent State, which was great. I had planned on going into medical and technical translation, but there wasn't a lot of work, especially for new translators. So I ended up specializing mostly in audiovisual from the start of my career. And then, of course, like a lot of things in the industry, once you do one show or one translation, that's enough to get your foot in the door for a lot of opportunities at other companies. So I've done a lot of work for Funimation before it was taken over by Crunchyroll. I have some work that's showcased on Netflix and Hulu. Some stuff is on Amazon Prime now. It's kind of fun to see how like different streaming networks end up with different TV shows over time. So it's kind of interesting to see where my subtitles end up. I do still freelance today. I do about 50 episodes of television per year, usually about like 1 movie if I get hired. This year I've done a couple different shows, but mostly I've been working on the dubbing side instead of subtitling, just because there's a little bit more demand right there right now. Yes, moving right along. I was actually hired full-time at Sega of America from 2017 to 2022 as a full-time in-house translator. Here I worked on games such as Persona 5, and I'll go through a couple of that in a little bit. Most of the time there, I was working on translating and localizing content within the game. So, all sorts of game text. There's a lot of voice lines because it's a very narrative-heavy game. So we were adapting voice scripts. And then when we were recording, I would spend 1 to 3 months attending voice recording with a couple dozen actors to make sure that everything was getting recorded in time. Over time at Sega, I started leveraging some of the training that I had in technology to help make our systems a little bit better. For example, when we first started in 2017, we were doing a lot of work just kind of out of Excel or working in plain text files. But I was able to leverage both my knowledge of MemoQ as well as some Python coding experience to be able to convert files from a basic Excel format into an XLIF format that would play a little bit nicer with our memo queue and our other CAP tools. From there, I was able to take that into a promotion to producer, where not only was I doing engineering, I was also coordinating the English, French, Italian, German, and Spanish localization of a couple different titles, including some Sonic games from start to finish. And then after they were released, when there was extra DLC or whatnot released. So as just mentioned, I worked on Persona 5 and Persona 5 Royal. And then I also worked on a couple of the Yakuza games, this Sonic Colors Ultimate, and I was the producer on the P3 and P4 remasters that were released, I believe, in 2022. Right. So as my time at Sega came to an end, I ended up in Hollywood working back in more video production. I was hired at Deluxe Hollywood as a localization producer, primarily working with Amazon Prime. My job was to make sure that Amazon Prime TV shows would get all of the dubs, all of the subs that were being ordered. So for example, last year I was primarily on Lord of the Rings, Rings of Power, which was a really, really fun project to be on as a Lord of the Rings fan, especially. But that was a show that went into 30 different dubbing language with an additional, I think, 10 languages on top of that just for subtitles. So it was my job to coordinate not just with the producers of the show, but also with each of those languages studios to ensure that any issues they had, any linguistic problems were something that I could get resolved. And not only that, but when you're working with something like Tolkien, you have a lot of books that have already been translated. You have a lot of legacy terminology that needs to be handled with care. So for every language, we also had a Tolkien expert, usually one of the foremost like PhD holders or, you know, literary scholars, or even of the original translator of The Hobbit in that language, who were coming onto the show to consult for the terminology to make sure everything was kept as the way it should be in that language pair. I also, another cool thing that I got to work on was the Amazon original Citadel. It's kind of like a spy show. It was one season a couple of years ago. I think the fun thing about that for me was one of the stars, Priyanka Chopra. She speaks Hindi natively, and she wants to dub herself in her own voice in Hindi. So I was able to work with her and her team to get her in her crazy schedule between Milan and, you know, out in Dubai and then going back to New York, getting her booked into multiple studios so she could record all of the lines that she acted in the show in Hindi. So when you watch Citadel in Hindi, you are hearing her own voice voicing herself in Hindi, which I thought was really cool. It's just really a very difficult thing to work out, especially with different actors and their schedules. But I think it's really important for the quality of the show. So that was super exciting. Yeah, and then I don't have a slide for this, but I did just leave Deluxe because I'm going back to the game industry. I moved to Tokyo this coming Saturday to start work at a Japanese video game company in Tokyo. So that's going to be really exciting. But as you can see, I love everything audiovisual, anything entertaining from movies to TV to anime to video games, like anything that has that audio and visual element is something that I really love to work on and love to see how we can localize. Which is a great segue into talking about what is audiovisual localization. Obviously, let's talk first about what localization is. In this context, we're referring to the act of adapting content to the language, culture, and preferences of the target audience. So obviously, when we're looking at something like a TV show or a video game, we're translating any linguistic content, whether that's text, whether that's speech, etc. But we're also looking at any kind of adaptation for non-linguistic content that affects the audience's understanding and experience of the original work. And we'll delve a little bit more into what that means when we get later in the presentation. And then, of course, audiovisual means content that have both an audio and a visual component. But there are many types of content that are audiovisual. So let's walk through those super quick. Obviously, the first thing that you might come up with is, oh, well, there's movies and TV. But there's another bit of video content that's started to get localized increasingly, and that's actually YouTube content. This is a clip from the YouTuber Mr. Beast, who you've probably heard of. What you probably don't know is that he dubs most of his content into between 20 to 40 different languages. I was actually a producer on the Mr. Beast show for Amazon Prime, and that show went into, I believe, 45 dub languages, which is absolutely incredible. It just goes to show when you have that kind of massive reach, that's what you kind of want to reach. So here's a short clip from one of his newer YouTube videos showing a Latin American Spanish dub of Mr. Beast.
El siguiente es el búnker de $1 millón. Se construyó originalmente para lanzar misiles y sobrevivir a un apocalipsis nuclear en las profundidades de la Tierra. Pero, ¿cómo se puede entrar en él? Bueno, después de bajar innumerables escaleras y abrir una puerta de 3.175 kilos... ¿Por qué pesa tanto esta puerta? Llegas al corazón del búnker.
¡Santa vaca!
¿Parece algo sacado de Star Wars?
Los misiles se lanzarían desde esta habitación. Toda esta instalación se diseñó para resistir un ataque nuclear y luego responderlo.
Dang, that's a crazy Spanish explosion. Let me know if the audio is still sounding okay. Other kinds of video content that we deal with would be educational content. For example, training videos that might be used as part of a government, like sexual harassment program, any kind of conference presentation or a documentary program, those will also need to be localized. Marketing as well can be audiovisual when you have TV ads or video billboards playing somewhere like Times Square or in Shibuya Station. Moving right along, we also have any kind of live event. So obviously presentations, if you're attending a conference session like this one or a TED Talk, you may want to have some kind of localization either live at the event via an interpreter or through some sort of, I don't want to say AI, but like an overlay of auto-generated subtitles or something like that. You can also do localization of performances, whether that's pre-recorded or live. So you've got plays, you have musicals, you have operas, which actually have some really cool things. You've probably heard of subtitles, but have you heard of surtitles? These are also known as super titles. If you go to a couple different places where they show operas, a lot of us don't speak Italian. We may not speak French or German, but we might want to enjoy the lyricism or the story of the opera. There are many opera houses now that have a very small screen at the top that's just big enough for maybe 1 to 2 lines of subtitles. And these are standardized throughout the world, and you can have your own captioning program. And there's usually a person in the back of the theater that automatically advances the subtitles based on the way that they're singing or performing that night. Really cool stuff. And then finally, we have interactive media that has audio and visual. So for example, there are websites and different kinds of software that may have interactive elements or text boxes you can click on. If you go into a website that has an audio or a video player, like the YouTube player needs to be localized so people who speak whatever language can interact with the video player the way that it's supposed to be. And then, of course, my favorite kind of interactive media, we have video games. And those, of course, can differ whether you're playing on your phone, when you're playing on a PC with really good graphics, if you're playing in an arcade, like kind of in a bowling alley. All of these kind of games have different needs for localization. So let's talk a little bit now about how we go about localizing audiovisual content. Obviously, there's so many different kinds of content. There's text, there's video, visuals, there's audio. What are the actual processes of localizing that for an audience? Before we get into the actual process, let's talk about what our goal of localizing content is, because the goal can't just be, oh, we need to translate it. There's always a little bit more that needs to go into it. Obviously, it's going to depend on the content that we are localizing, but typically when it comes to entertainment, we're looking to create an equivalent experience in the target audience. For example, we want to make sure our audience understands the content the way it was written. If we translate it incorrectly, then maybe they'll get the wrong idea. Maybe they think this character is a boy instead of a girl, or maybe they think that this person didn't kill their sister or whatever. So we want to make sure they understand the content in the same way. We also want to make sure they have the same emotional reaction to the content as the original audience. For example, if somebody tells a joke in the original that's supposed to be funny, then the joke should be funny in the target translation as well. If the joke literally translated isn't funny, then we may want to see about making the joke funny to the target audience. And then if we're looking at something like a website or a game, we want to make sure we enable the same level of interaction. For example, like all the buttons should be interactable, like all the text should fit correctly into the text boxes, all of the dialogue should be swapped out so you can interact with the character the same way. So when we approach a new text or a new piece of content to localize it, the first thing we want to ask ourselves is, what do we need to localize to achieve this goal of equivalent experience? And we'll do a little bit of semi-interactive content here. I'm going to show about a minute clip from the video game that I worked on, Persona 5. Already you can see that there's some text on screen. You're going to notice a lot of things going by both in the visuals and the audio. But as we go through this clip of kind of exploring and then a battle scene, try and think about how much that we're seeing or hearing needs to be localized for the audience to have the experience. Let's start.
What do you think about
Oh, really?
Okay.
Everyone's here.
There!
All right, Queen. Beautifully done.
Persona! Who's next?
Nice work, team.
All right, I know that was a lot, but there's a lot of things to localize in this game. So let's go over it super quick. So again, what do we need to localize to achieve this goal? We don't need to localize everything. We don't need to change character names. We don't necessarily need to swap out character models or change any of the graphics. So what is important to localize so our audience can enjoy this game? So we'll start with the visuals because those are a little bit easier to identify. We've obviously got dialogue text. Anytime characters are talking and there's a dialogue box, we want that to be readable. We've got user interface text, which can be anything from displaying the names of locations that you can just go to on the very bottom of the screen showing what each button on your keypad will do. We have pop-up text coming from when you walk past certain items or certain people, things will pop up. And then we also have signs and graphics for things that are on stores or in background items. We may need to contact the developers to get the original files for those to create our own English or Spanish, etc. alternatives to replace those with. When we look at audio, it's a lot more than just dubbing over what the characters are saying. Obviously, again, we have our dialogue, but there's also background chatter. There are characters who are speaking in the background. When you're walking past a character, they may call out to you. That also needs to be dubbed. We have what we call battle voices. So anytime you're using a different kind of attack or you're doing some kind of interaction with another character, those also need to be translated and recorded. Any kind of impacts, like if you get hit by an attack or, in Street Fighter, if another character punches your character, you need to re-record those as well to make sure the new dub actor sounds exactly the same, whether they're talking or being, punched in the face. We've got monster dialogue because the monsters also speak Japanese, and we now localize that into English. We need to use special audio filters to make them sound the same way that they did in the original. And then finally, depending on what you're working with and how important the song is, you may need to also localize the song lyrics so that anybody who's playing it in another language can also get the same experience hearing that song in their language. So there's a lot going on here. Luckily, we didn't have to localize the songs in Persona 5 because they came in English already, but a lot of stuff to do, lots of files to work on. And then of course, they all come together in very interesting ways. Right then, let's talk about the actual localization processes that we do to create these localized pieces of work. The first process that we see most often is going to be text replacement. We'll see that in video games, etc. Here's a screenshot from the Japanese version of Persona 5. You can see how at the top left where it says Saturday, it also includes the Japanese character for Saturday, as well as the time, go. And there's an English for exit. So we don't need to replace the exit, but we can replace everything else. So now you can see we've removed the character from after the day of the week, and everything else has been localized and using different fonts and graphics. So super great work. Persona 5 is a really interestingly designed game. They do a lot of cool things with text, of course, and then we have to do cool things with text in our language as well. So that was a really fun game to work on. Moving right along to different processes, we have text addition. So obviously we're looking at subtitles on like an anime or subtitles for a foreign film, but this also includes what we call narrative titles. So for example, if you're watching a TV show dubbed into Spanish, all of the text that's still on there, if it was originally made in English, is still going to be in English. So you can see here that they've included a narrative title that translates Manitowoc County into the target language's equivalent so they can have the same experience. And then, as we kind of talked about before with dubbing, we have audio replacement. There's different types of voice dubbing we can do. So I'm going to go into that very quickly here. And this is, again, using both video games and TV. So one type of voice dubbing we use, especially in the video game realm, is wild and timed dubbing. For wild dubbing, it means we don't need to match any timing. We can just record a new line in English for as long as we need to. For timed, let's say it's during like a cutscene or something special is happening, we might need to make sure the new line is the same length or shorter than the original line. Typically, this means when we go into the voice booth, we know exactly how long the line has to be. So we write the line to be about that length, and we tell the actor, okay, this needs to be under 2.3 seconds. We do a couple takes to make sure that's within that time limit, so we can then replace the audio file in the video game. The best part about wild and time dubbing is we don't need to match any mouth animation because it's just kind of playing over these kind of puppet characters. So here's an example from, again, Persona 5, showing how this kind of wild dubbing is used.
Want anything, Futaba?
Orange juice, 100% natural.
So the mouth movements there is just kind of a randomized animation, even in the Japanese. So we can just record however long or however much we need to, as long as it fits within the text box. Moving right along, we have, if my PowerPoint decides to do it, excellent. We have voice over dubbing. This is when translation is read by a voiceover artist, but not necessarily matching the mouth movements. And you can also hear the original audio being played. You're typically seeing this in things like news or documentaries. For example, here's a clip from NHK showing how we use English voiceover dubbing for an originally Japanese clip.
We want to enliven the agriculture industry. Young people have a completely innovative way of thinking, and their ideas are different from us. We want to rely on them for our community and agriculture.
Interestingly enough, this type of dubbing is also very popular in countries such as Russia and Poland. This is a clip from an animated show that I worked on where when they dubbed it into Russian, they kept the original Japanese audio and then dubbed Russian voices over it. You can hear a sample of that right now.
Тебе тут такая посылка пришла.
Huh?
It might sound really different to us, but this is considered standard in those territories, which was very interesting for me getting into television dubbing because I didn't understand why for Polish they only needed one dubbing voice actor, because that single voice actor will do all of the voices for all of the characters by reading over what they said. And then the final type of dubbing that you're probably most used to is lip sync dubbing, which is also known as ADR. This is when all of the voices or most of the voices are replaced with a new voice in the target language. And the most difficult part about this is we need to rewrite our translation or adapt our script to match the mouth movements that are shown on screen. And then as a fun little clip, I've included the Japanese dub of The Lord of the Rings, Rings of Power, so you can see how the translation is adapted to the mouth movements on screen.
何か資格はあるか？
資格って
海洋警備隊か？
船乗りとしての腕なら
海洋警備隊に属しているのか？女王の衛兵か？将校ギルドか？
たかが資格
馬の飼育は
バカバカしいよ
お前が伝統に忠誠を尽くすふりをしている間、彼らは実際働いていたんだ。
Going deeper a little bit into voice dubbing, the way that we write the script is actually really particular because we want to make sure we not only capture performance, but we want to make sure that we divvy up the lines in a way that'll make sense when we're recording it. Because typically we'll record once, twice, 3 times for each line. And it's much easier to split everything up by line than to go back and try to do a whole bunch at once. So here's a little bit of a clip from, again, a show that the same animated show that I worked on. On screen, I've also included all of the dubbing lines as they were from the script. So go ahead and take a look and see how this has been adapted.
It's just like the theater I went to in Tokyo when I was little. The same kind of fancy. Shh.
Zip your lip, Miss Watanabe.
Oh, sorry. Watanabe. I feel...
Hey, you're from JPX.
Come on, Say, don't make a scene.
Oh, sorry about that. Good afternoon, ma'am.
Are you in the 100th class? You're all so cute.
How's the Phantom doing?
Mr. Ando is well, thank you.
You know he's an ex-actor, right? So he's always had a pretty hard time fitting in with the other teachers. Try to go easy on him, okay?
Right.
All right. Like I said, let me know if the video, if I'm in the way at all. But let's take a look at how the scene is actually written in the script file we use in the booth. So the first thing you'll notice is we want to make sure our time code there is on the left. That'll tell us exactly how long each line is supposed to play, assuming they're not overlapping. It also gives our audio engineer something to start with once he starts getting all of these lines in. Our next column here is our speaker name. You'll notice that there's one at the top that says Walla. That is not a character name. That is just what we call chattering or background kind of noise. The original theatergoers chatting noise was in Japanese, but we've replaced it with English theatergoers chatting to make it sound a little bit more natural. And then, of course, we have all of our different characters as well. And because we have everything divvied up by character, we can highlight it for the actors when they come in. For example, when we have the actor for Sarasa come in, we highlight all of the lines yellow. So while she can read the dialogue between herself and some of the other characters, it's very easy for her to see, okay, that's my next line, that's my next line. From there, we have our dialogue. Excuse me. A little bing from Windows, thank you. We have our dialogue. You'll see here that we've got a couple of little lines, especially at the end there where it says OM and CM. Those means that they're not necessarily a dialogue line, but it's kind of a vocal reaction. So as you see, OM means open mouth reaction. CM means a closed mouth reaction. We can have things like OM joyful awe. So that gives the actor a little bit of an idea of what kind of noise she needs to make before she starts her line. These can be very exciting, especially when you're doing something like a big battle scene. You get people getting punched in the face and whatnot. You get to write them in a very interesting way. And these voice actors do a very good job. And then finally, we have the original translation. It might seem a little strange to wonder why we might keep the original translation when we already have the adapted dialogue. But the truth is, no matter how long you've been writing for dub adaptation, you're never always going to get it perfectly right. So there'll be times when you're in the booth with an actor and you read the line 3 or 4 times and it's just not working. It's nice to have the translation on the side so you can say, okay, let's adjust it this way. Okay, this is what the original translation was. What can we add or subtract to make this line work? So typically we'll keep the translation on the side just to help us if we need to do some additional adaptation. So if you've probably noticed from all of this explanation so far, audiovisual localization is extremely challenging. But that's because audiovisual media has a lot more constraints than, say, if we were translating a book. The first constraint that we run into that you may have already noticed is the timing and length. For example, if we're reading subtitles, audiences must be able to read the subtitle before it disappears. There's a great example of this from a show called The Tatami Galaxy, and you'll see why it's super important that we can read the subtitles in this short clip.
キ君、下鴨湧水槽の人だろう。いかにも私は下鴨湧水槽の住人である。そうですが、私も住んでいる。下鴨湧水槽とは叡山出町柳浦にある下宿で、聞いたところによると幕末の混乱期に消失して再建以後そのままであるという。窓から明かりが漏れていなければ廃墟同然。入学したばかりの頃大学生協の紹介でここを訪れた時、空論城に迷い込んだのかもと思ったのも無理からぬ話だ。そうだ、この奇妙な怪人を幾度か見かけていたことを思い出した。
This might be a TV show best suited to watch for the dub, not the sub, if you can't read very fast. Speaking of dubbing, timing and length have a lot of trip us up a lot as well. For example, our dubbed voiceover needs to be the same length as our original voice line. However, our source and target languages may have different syllabic rates and different information densities. What does that mean? So let's take this line in Japanese, for example. Tomodachi no yuutori desu means your friend is right. In this example, the entire line takes about 12 syllables and 3 seconds to say out loud. If we were to say that directly translated into English, we would just say, your friend is right. That's only 4 syllables, and you can say it a lot faster because it's less syllables. If we were to translate that into Spanish, tu amigo tiene razón, that's going to be 7 syllables and 2 seconds. So depending on the language, the timing and length is going to be different. If we're adapting from a TV show that's originally made in Japanese with Japanese audio, when we dub it, the target translation must match the speed and number of syllables, which now means if we're adapting it to English or Spanish, we need to write a line that matches those 12 syllables and takes up that full 3 seconds. And then vice versa, if we're taking something from English and trying to adapt that into Japanese, now we only have 4 syllables to work with in Japanese. How do we kind of reverse engineer that? So always a big thorn in my side, that one. Here's an example of how that affected dubbing in, again, this same show that I worked on. So here is what the original Japanese line looks like. I've slowed it down a bit so you can see the animation and the syllables.
はい。サラサは今日で16歳になりました。
If you might have noticed from the animation, it doesn't necessarily match how many syllables she said. So what we can do when we're adapting
サラサは今日で16歳になりました。
is look at how many lip or mouth movements there are and try to match that in our translation. Here, obviously, if we change it to just, yes, today I turned 16, we're missing a lot of syllables because of the difference in syllabic density between Japanese and English. So when we're adapting, we need to add in syllables or provide a little bit more linguistic information to fill in that gap. So this is how we did it in English. Go.
That's right. Today I celebrate my 16th birthday.
Worked out great. Moving right along to another constraint, we always have to think about the placement of text. Any text that we're placing or adding must be legible and fit with any constraints. The hardest part, especially of game adaptation, is that we can't change the size of text boxes or really the size of a game font. So if you're adapting from Japanese to English, typically the translation expands. So as you can see here, this hold left shift to dance spills out of the original box, which means you now need to go back into the translation and make it smaller to fit into that box. It is the biggest challenge of all of game localization. I would say about half the time I spent working on video games was just making translations fit into different size boxes. Not only that, but because we're dealing with visual elements on screen, our dialogue may reference these visual elements. So we can't necessarily take them out of the translation. This is my favorite example from a show here where it says, I hear in Tokyo, one pays for travel in watermelons. This is a reference to the Japanese Metro card in Tokyo, which is called Suica, which is short for like easy card. But Suica also means watermelons. So here we have a character who's new to Tokyo saying, oh, you pay for it with a Suica, right? If we were using like translating for a book or, just doing an audio translation, we could change that to, maybe a silly like a Metro card, maybe it's a Petco card. But because we have a watermelon on screen, we have to include watermelons as part of the translation just because we can't get away from it. We can't change the original TV show. So luckily, we have linguistic theory, which will help us tackle some of these challenges in kind of new and creative ways. So we're going to talk about my favorite parts of linguistic theory. We've already talked about this a little bit in the earlier section, but there's a concept called equivalence. This is when the original, the source, and the target translation function equally in form, function, structure, meaning, etc. The asterisk is there because perfect equivalence is always impossible because language and culture are very complex. There are two different types of equivalence that are defined. There's formal equivalence, which is typically called a literal translation. This is more oriented towards the source. So it'll adhere to source grammar and structure. It'll also avoid translating any kind of cultural items. It may leave a little footnote. It may add a little bit of text, but it's not going to outright change what's in it. Dynamic equivalence is what we typically call a localized translation. It's more oriented towards the target language as well as the target audience. So it's going to adhere closer to target linguistic expectations. It may change the grammar around a little bit. So a sentence might get rearranged. It may also explain or localize cultural items. For example, when the original Power Rangers was brought over from Japan to the US, there were a lot of cultural items that they either took out or completely replaced with like an American high school to make it appeal better to an American audience. When we're working in entertainment, we're typically looking at dynamic equivalence because we're looking to create that equivalence. And it's a little bit more difficult to do that when you're adhering to source grammar or when you're trying to be too source oriented. One way we can try to get to equivalence is by writing dialogue that sounds natural. the ground rule that I tell everybody is if the dialogue sounds natural to the original audience, then it should sound natural to the translation audience as well. There's a small cohort of the foreign film enjoyers that think, oh, well, the translation should sound stilted and want it to sound a little bit more like the original grammar. And while that can be very helpful, especially if you're learning the language, it's not necessarily helpful to create an equivalent experience in the target audience because now they're spending so much time kind of tripping up over what sounds like very unnatural speech. And again, as a target audience, especially if you're showing something in a movie theater on Amazon Prime, we're expecting the dialogue we're listening to sound like natural English in our example. One thing that I do a lot as a translator when I'm struggling with a translation is I ask, what would this character or what would this text say if the original writer wrote this in English? If our dialogue sounds unnatural, and then I found a nice little clip of something that wasn't translated very well, it can be very distracting for the audience. It kind of takes them out of the moment where they're noticing that this line doesn't sound quite right. It also makes it more difficult to read. If you'll remember the clip that we saw earlier, where the subtitles are flying by, you really have to be able to keep up with it. And reading speed is always something we're challenged with when we're writing subtitles. We can't write them too long or have too much words inside of that subtitle, or people won't be able to read it and watch the show. Studies have shown that if there are typos, if there are grammatical errors or issues with unnatural sounding speech in subtitles, it makes the audience take longer to read the subtitle or even make them read the subtitle twice, which of course then prevents them from actually watching the show. And again, it's not equivalent. It's supposed to sound like natural dialogue, unless it's supposed to be a robot speaking in an unnatural dialogue, in which case then it would be equivalent. It all depends on the context. Another technique that we use that comes from linguistic theory is deverbalization. We use deverbalization to derive the meaning, what's really being said by a character, and then reformulate that meaning in the target language. To show a little graphic here, we have our source and our target text. We use deverbalization to take the meaning away from the linguistic text. So we don't want to think about the words. We don't want to know who's saying it, what's going on. We want to think about the meaning. What's being said? Why are they saying it? Oh, she's frustrated with him. She's worried about this. She's not necessarily chastising him, but she wants to make sure she warns him. Then we take all of that meaning without looking at the source text, and we put that into the target text through reformulation. Here's an example from a show that I worked on where I used reformulation to make what should be a very touching scene sound a little bit more natural. So here is the original Japanese with both the romanization breakdown and I like to go in and categorize each little bit of meaning in, how happened. I'm listening to the sound of your heart. A literal translation literally just says, what will you know by doing this? And she says, the coldness of a person. If we deverbalize this a bit, it's very clear she's listening, she's being very, comforting to him. She's listening to the sound of her heart. They're both very cold because it's the winter. And it's kind of leading into this first scene where they finally have their first kiss. So here we did a little bit of deverbalization to make this sound more natural in English.
どうしたの？
心臓の音を聞いている。
これで何がわかるの？
人の冷たさ。
So here the translation is not necessarily completely different, but we have used some localization tricks to make it sound a little bit more natural, especially between two teenagers that are talking to each other. Another bit of linguistic theory we can apply is functionalism, where instead of focusing on the meaning, we're focusing on the function of the words and the meaning presented in the source. I like to compare functionalism to equivalence, where equivalence is the what's being said. How are we expressing this meaning in our translation? And functionalism is the why. Why is this being said? Why did the writer put this in here? And then how do we express this purpose in the translation? A really great way to illustrate functionalism is through puns and humor. And here's a great clip from The Simpsons.
I'll be snaking those jewels and Venom gotta go. Sorry I didn't ask your permission. Hope that's Cobra-cetic.
Hey, jerk, puns are lazy writing. Go!
Puns are great, and you can fight me on that. But let's think about the function of a pun in writing. What is the function of a pun? Well, it's supposed to add humor. Puns are funny. I don't care what you say they are. It can display personality. I'm sure you've got a friend in your friend group who's probably more likely to make a silly pun than another. And then we also have a lot of cultural tropes around puns. The hardest thing about translating pun-related humor is they're often connected to these on-screen visuals, which means we can't change the concept we're playing with. So let's examine this scene from The Simpsons a little bit more. I'll be snaking these Jews and Venom gotta go. Sorry, I didn't ask for your permission. What is the function of this line? Why did the writers include this in the script? We can break it down super simple. Well, he is telling everybody what he is doing. He is stealing the jewels and then leaving. He's being kind of taunty. He's, showing everybody that he's more important than them. He's using snake words, which is important because he is the serpent. He's got a big snake in an S right on the front of his torso. So we need to keep the snake words in. And then again, this is supposed to make the audience laugh. Again, this is funny. I will not be taking comments on that. So when we consider those functions, if we're translating this into Arabic or into Japanese or into Spanish, we want to make sure we're picking a translation that will do all of these functions at the same time. So not necessarily using the word coprosthetic, but we can maybe find another snake pun that does the same thing where he's taunting them and using snake words, and again, accomplishing these functions. Come on, Photoshop. Or PowerPoint, you can do it. I'm usually yelling at Photoshop. So here's another scene from a show. I did not work on this show, but it has a really great example of a pun. Here it's a pun on the word mukade ga mukade kururu. The two words sound very similar. It's an extremely bad pun on the word centipede and coming towards me. It's one bad pun in a scene of her making a lot of bad puns to try and get her friends to react. So we're looking now at the function instead of the meaning. Like obviously in English, a pun on centipede and coming towards me isn't going to work as well. But we just need to make it a bad pun that's going to work. Here, the word coming towards me doesn't work that well, but the translator was able to find a translation that worked for the function of the scene, as we can see here.
ねえ、ムカデに襲われた人がなんて言ったか知ってる？ムカデがうがってくる！つってね！
Again, it's not a very funny pun, which is why her friends don't react, but it still has the exact same function of the original Japanese pun. Taking this now into the world of video games, we can apply the same functionalism when a translation won't fit. These are two different skill names from a game where you can kind of upgrade your abilities as you're going through. For example, you can get an increased magic power storage, but small, and you can get superior olfaction, which is great. When we're translating these, we want to think about the functions of these text strings. What's important to communicate to the player? Obviously, we want to make sure the player knows what these little skills that they're, upgrading do. What does increased magic power store do? It increases your storage of magic power, but in a small way. Superior olfaction probably makes you really good at smelling. One other thing we can glean from this is that the small at the end kind of implies that there are different upgrades you can get that might be bigger or even higher level than that. Another thing that's important to realize is that when people are playing video games, they've typically played a lot of different video games, and they're expecting certain types of gaming terminology. For example, if you've played like any games that have something called magic power, you're typically expecting them to say MP. You don't need them to tell you what MP is. If you play a lot of video games, that's just what you know. So you need to have all of this in mind when you're trying to make a translation that fits. And fitting is important because you only have this much space to put all of that text, and you can't change the font size. So when we consider function, we end up with increased MP1. It fits within the box. It's using MP, which is signaling to our audience, hey, I know I know you know what you're doing. It's magic power. And the 1 signals to the character that there are going to be extra levels of this upgrade that they can get in the same way as that little parentheses small said. If we look at that second one, superior olfaction, in Japanese, that is just 4 letters. Superior olfaction is a lot more than that. But again, we can think of the function and think about how we want to put that in. Here's 2 different ones that I came up with. that are pretty easy to fit in. They both sound like something that could be in a video game, especially nose knows. We know that in video games, they like to get creative with language, but they're also very short. They fit in and they tell you that it has to do something with being good at smelling things. So when we're translating audiovisual media, there's a couple different things we want to think about before we go and dive in. The first thing we want to do is be aware of our constraints, whether we're working on a video ad for Times Square, if we're working on a video game, if we're translating subtitles for an opera, we want to know what our constraints are. How big is the text box? What's our font size? Where is the text going to be appearing? How much time do we have to show that text or to have that audio being playing to everybody? And then when we create our localization, we want to make sure that we're conveying equivalent meaning. We're not translating words to words. The meaning, and again, the function of that meaning is important, is almost more important than the actual linguistic phonemes that are being spoken. And like I just said, we want to consider these key functions of difficult to translate phrases. Is it important that it's a pun? If you're translating a rap, is it more important that you say the same message as the rap, or should the rap rhyme? Is there a way you can rhyme and do the message at the same time? If not, what's more important? In the end, we want to focus on retaining that equivalence, whether that's in meaning or function. That helps us identify what route we should take with a certain line of dialogue, or even with our approach to an entire TV show. So yes, that was all that I came with. Thank you so much for hosting me. I could talk probably for another hour about localization theory. There's some really cool stuff, especially with the intersection between different subgenres of fiction, like fantasy fiction or sci-fi fiction, with language and translation that I would love to chat about, but I've already taken up a lot of your time. So thank you so much for having me. I had a really great time talking.
Thank you, Katrina. So we're going to open up to questions. Anybody have questions for Katrina?
Is one enough time?
Let's just make it here. Katrina, can you hear him?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, good. You said that you worked with the voice actors. Like, how directly would you say you work with them? Do you are you in the same room when doing a session, or over a voice call or whatever?
Yeah, so it really depends on the project. Sometimes when I'm writing voice lines, like I'm already on another project by the time they start recording. But when I was working on Persona 5 and a couple other games, I was in the booth with the voice actors. Or technically the voice actor was in the booth and I was seated right outside of it with the audio engineer and the director. And then if there were any issues, or for example, like if they've been trying to record the same line 4 times and it's just not fitting, then I can rewrite it right there and then provide it to the director to have them record. So yeah, I have worked with quite a few voice actors. During the pandemic, actually, of course, we were doing everything via Zoom calls or via like Teams calls and whatnot. So I have done quite a bit of remote recording on top of in-person recording as well.
And also another thing off of that, how many times would you say that you've actually worked with 2 or more voice actors recording in the same room?
Never. Here in the US, and I would say in most Western countries, it's typical for voice actors to record separately. It's just a little bit more cost effective. It's easier for scheduling. Because I mean, even if you have adult friends, it's hard just to get 2 people in the same room at the same time. So it's even harder when you have people who are working on multiple creative projects. So typically we're just recording 1 person in the booth at a time, which is why it's so much more exciting to see these movies or these TVs come together where, you know, these characters seem to be interacting with each other so passionately when really they were recorded 6 weeks apart.
So typically when characters are recording voice lines, say for like a scene where this character is talking to another character, does the voice actor have no knowledge of whatever voice line they're supposed to be bouncing off of?
They will have the script. So when I showed the script earlier, they can see what the other voice line will be. If they're not 100% sure, they can always ask us as well, because I'm right there on the other side of the glass. But 9 out of 10 times, they do not have the voice line they're reacting to.
Oh.
Yeah, which is why it makes it so much more exciting.
I recall learning about like various movies nowadays, like they take a lot of precautions to make sure that like the voice actors actually know as little about the script as possible. For example, I remember, this isn't actually like a dubbed example, but I remember, I don't remember what show it was on, but Charlie Day was talking about his role in the Mario movie, and he said that they were very protective of the script. Like they gave him the select lines to voice, and he did not know anything else about the story of the movie. at large only knew whatever his lines were supposed to be communicating from a glance. Is
Yeah,
it the same way?
that is not usually how it is. So that was done for security purposes. Like for example, when we were working on Lord of the Rings, we didn't want any of that to leak. So we had very big security precautions on that project. For example, when we were providing videos, pretty much the video was completely black except for a circle around each person's face, so that they could match the voice to the lip movements of the character. But there would be certain times where, like, Frodo would go, look over there, and then the screen would go black because there's no characters to look at. So a lot of the times I would have to provide, notes saying like they are pointing at a big castle. The castle has walls that are about 20 feet high or whatnot, because depending on the language, they could have a different word for castle if it's a small castle or a tall castle, whatnot. This was one issue we did actually have in Lord of the Rings. But yeah, I would say that's very, very rare. It's only if there are really big security concerns for things like leaks getting out or information getting out at all. Like anybody who works in the entertainment industry is under like 5 levels of NDA for at least like 5 to 10 years after they get off a project. Just because it's a lot more exciting when viewers are able to be surprised by things like, I guess, the script of the Mario movie. I know that was really anticipated, so I can see why they would do that, but that's typically not what happens. Usually
for anime dubbing, game dubbing, etc., the actors usually record their lines separately. They they record their lines maybe at home or in a booth, but like they're not with the other voice actors. They don't usually meet the voice actors of the characters that they're playing against.
Correct. Yeah, typically in English dubbing, at least now that we're out of the pandemic, we do prefer that people come into the studio just because it's easier, because we have the same mic set up. We know how to get it tuned for the character or for the person's voice, versus when you're working with remote studios, the engineering can be a little bit more fiddly. It's doable, but again, that's why we usually prefer for people to come into the studio. But yeah, typically in American dubbing, it is one person in the booth with a voice director and perhaps a writer. I know in Japan, depending on the project, they may have 2 to 5 people all recording at the same time so they can play off each other. But again, that's more localized to the Japanese recording experience and not to the American recording experience.
Any questions?
I may have missed it in the beginning, but I was just curious on how you yourself got to where you are. Just because like there's some types that are more gig work versus company experience versus like, did you have a mentor that brought you into it, or did you like find yourself where you were?
I was really lucky, to be honest. And I mean, as you know, with any kind of job, you have to be there at the right time and place when the position is open. So I was applying for a lot of different freelance work because I knew I wanted to do freelance translation, especially coming straight out of my master's degree. So I was applying everywhere I could. I was initially not even applying for audiovisual because that wasn't what I wanted to go into. But I had a couple friends say, like, well, you like anime, you like TV and stuff. Why aren't you applying to do that? I applied to a couple different companies, and then one company said, we are hiring more translators right now. Will you take our test? So I was able to take the test. I passed the test, and then they brought me on for a couple projects. And then again, once you get a couple projects under your belt, it's much easier to get in. I would say nowadays, like 10 years out, LSPs are typically the people who are handling translation. So I know like Deluxe has a large pool of subtitle translators they hire out. For dubbing or like ADR script writing, typically a studio will have their own adapters that are working freelance for them. It's very rare for there to be in-house translation jobs outside of things that are super technical. For example, like if you're an in-house interpreter at Honda, or I know there are some game companies do have in-house, but unfortunately right now we're kind of at a race to the bottom for who can pay the least for translation. So a lot of these companies are trying to hire LSPs who will pay translators less.
Yeah.
Yeah, I had 2 kind of almost bouncing off of that. It was more about kind of like the time in between projects. So you word it like once you've gotten one project, you mentioned like the whole foot in the door thing. Does it usually like take some time before like another studio hires you? Or are you like immediately looking for the next project? Is it one thing that just kind of flows into the next?
Yeah, and it really depends on the health of the industry as well as like how well your, contractee is doing. I was very lucky when I got hired with Sentai Filmworks that they had a large breadth of titles they were bringing, not just for immediate broadcast, but also some like older titles they were bringing out now for like a DVD release. I worked on a lot of stuff from like the 1980s and 1990s that were just getting like DVD releases that had never been translated before. So I was really lucky in that where I would do 20 episodes for over like 2 to 3 weeks, and then immediately get picked up for another project. I would say nowadays, because there's so many more people doing subtitling, and again, it's a kind of a race to the bottom that everyone's trying to find out who will do it for less. I haven't had as much subtitling work as I have in previous years. I'm getting a little bit, but it also depends on what kind of subtitling you're going into. For example, like with Japan, a lot of TV shows are on a seasonal structure. So I know like going into winter season starts in January. So right around now or next month, I'll start talking with my employers saying, hey, do you have any shows for January that you want me on? If they say yes, then I'll be booked for that entire season to work on that show. And then once a week, I'll work on the episode as it comes out. I know here in the US with Hollywood, typically we're seeing shows come out, like they've released the first 3 and then they'll do it on a weekly basis. But most of the subtitling is done almost a month before it even premieres. So that would be something where you would get almost everything all at once or kind of piecemeal over the 2 to 3 months before the release. And then you would be translating and then revising, of course, if there's a revised version of the video. But to answer your question with projects coming in, it really depends on who you're working for, if they like your work, if your rates are working for them or the client that they're currently working with. It's a really, the industry is not in the healthiest state right now, but I would say probably within the next 1 to 2 years, we're going to see it start to even out a bit. And Hollywood is now coming out of the writer's strike. We're coming out of the pandemic. We're seeing a lot more productions being made. But again, if the economy takes a downturn, it means less TV shows are being made and less work for people like us. So long story short, it depends.
And then I did have another similar question. It was about, maybe you kind of answered it. You mentioned subs and dubs being ordered.
Yes.
I guess I was going to ask about like how that happens and what defines whether a show gets subs and dubs ordered.
Yeah. And again, it depends on the show. It depends on who they're going for. So when I worked at Amazon, for example, like for Lord of the Rings, Rings of Power, they would send us an email at Deluxe saying, hey, season 2 of Rings of Power is coming in because of the languages we want it for. For example, on Rings of Power, when it was originally done for season 1, they ordered maybe 40 languages of dubs. And hoping that all of these countries, all these different languages, people would watch it. Then after season 1, they realized, okay, like these 3 countries did not really watch as much as we thought they would. Dubbing is also much more expensive than subtitling. So they decide, okay, we're going to cut out maybe like, we're going to keep Brazilian Portuguese, but we're going to subtitle European Portuguese instead. Or we're going to drop Galician and then only do Catalan and Spanish for Spain. So they at least were able to come from kind of like those demographics from viewing and say, okay, we don't want to have this language anymore. It's not worth the investment. On the other hand, like when we were working on Citadel, they really wanted this to be a big franchise. They wanted to reach as many people as possible. So when they came in with the original order, they said, we want to do these many languages. On other hand, like I've worked on small TV shows like coming out of India or Bollywood, where they know like we're not going to be able to get the viewership numbers on this in Brazilian Portuguese or in Russian. So instead, they only choose to offer maybe like an English dub with an additional subtitle because they know that's what's going to get the most viewing. So in the end, it kind of comes down to like, what's their cost benefit? Is there a benefit to dubbing this in this language? Are more people going to watch? Are people going to purchase Amazon Prime to watch it in this language? And then they get the statistics to back it up. So yeah, it's kind of a heavy balancing thing. And I'm really glad that I don't make those decisions.
So if you had mentioned that prior to you working in the industry, you had done fan-made captioning prior. So how important was that to you before going into the industry? And then do you still use the skill sets that you had back then into what you're doing now, like producing?
Yeah, I would say my fan translation work practice is practice. I mean, the same with speaking language, same with playing a sport. I had effectively, by doing so much fan translation, given myself practice in, how do I make a translation fit in this bubble? Or how do I make this translation subtitle fit on screen long enough for it to be read before it disappears? So I kind of was able to learn the basics through that. And then again, I just did years and years of practice. So by the time I was getting to the point where I wanted to test for a company to do translation for them, I had that practice and that experience to help me do a little bit of better job on that test. That doesn't necessarily mean that you need to be fan translating, or you need to do that to get into the industry. Also, depending on the side of the industry you're in, telling anybody that you have done that kind of piracy translation is not always a good thing. I've definitely had one or two employers who found out about it and got very upset with me, even though I wasn't doing it anymore. I mean, as soon as I got hired legitimately, like, I'm not going to take my career by pirating or, breaking my NDA or et cetera. I like making money. I don't want to jeopardize that. But there were definitely some very difficult conversation I had to have. I'd be like, no, I was a teenager. It was silly. I had to get my experience in. So I can't say I recommend it. But, if you're translating for yourself, it's always great to get that kind of experience in, just so you can, have a little bit of a leg up when you do go into the industry.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I have a question about localization. At what point does the original, it's whatever the concept is so deep into folklore or cultural idioms or whatever that it's just there's no way we're ever going to get this into English. What do you do in those cases?
So I have three answers for this, and this is a good question because I've encountered this many times. The first answer is those won't get localized because there's no market for them. If it's really, really niche and it's really, really hard to translate, it's going to be very hard to find somebody in that target audience who actually wants to enjoy it localized. Like, if there's somebody who's into that, they probably should study some Japanese and maybe get into it that way. The second answer to that is you find somebody who's specialized for it. So one example I have is maybe like 5 or 6 years ago, I was working for my anime company. They came to me with a project. They say, we've got this project. It's about like this one girl, and she's got like 6 beautiful men who all like want her hand in marriage or whatever. But each one of the men is a different reincarnation of the historical Buddha. And that's like the whole comedy of the show is like, oh, this guy is this Buddha and this guy is this Buddha. And I had to turn the project down because I'm like, it sounds really interesting, but I do not know enough about the reincarnations of the Buddha to not only understand the jokes, but make it funny in a way that the audience, who I presume would be people who think the reincarnations of the Buddha is really funny or interesting, would want to watch. So that was one of the only projects that I've had to turn down just because it was a little bit too esoteric. The third answer I have is there was actually a manga, a Japanese comic, that was canceled. The localization was canceled a couple of issues in. It was in Shonen Jump, which is kind of like this big weekly magazine. And every week there's a new chapter of like 20 to 30 different series. There was a new series that was primarily based around like, a guy going and solving mysteries, and there's all these crazy puzzles and whatnot. But these puzzles were increasingly linguistic to the point where like you had to dissect Chinese characters and like put them back together in a certain way. And it got to the point where I think 5 or 6 chapters in, the translator literally emailed his producer and said, I can't do this anymore. It's too much work. I'm not getting paid hourly. I'm being paid by the page. Like, it's too esoteric. I don't think this is even worth translating just because you're killing all of the value. It's a linguistic puzzle thing. It's not going to work in English unless you completely rewrite it. And he's not a puzzle maker. He's a translator. So they ended up canceling it, saying like, you could still read it in Japanese if you want, but we don't have anybody who is good enough at writing English word puzzles to localize this, because again, like, and they also have all the Chinese characters printed on. You can see the characters walking around the puzzle and like these, again, it's very connected to the visuals. So in the end, they decided to cancel the localization. Even though a lot of people are like, no, it's really cool. We enjoy it. It's like, no, dude, like, it's not worth it. So yeah, I think it's a really interesting question, and it's definitely, it pops up every now and then, but yeah, it's difficult. Not everything should or can be localized.
You sometimes just ignore it and just keep going. I mean, I think the one example pops to my mind is Maison de Koku, the manga where all the characters' names are actually puns in Japanese, and they just said, we're not going to bother trying to translate the English. So the English audience has no idea what's going on with that. But it's a romance, so who cares?
Can
yeah. Go ahead.
Have you ever heard of Ace Attorney?
Yes.
I mean, do you know like the amount of work that goes into localizing the Japanese pun in those games?
Yep. say all the character names in Ace Attorney as well are puns. But Ace Attorney is unlike a lot of other localizations of Japanese games, especially from that era, because back in that era of localization, people typically didn't localize names. They typically kept more to a more formal equivalence, a lot more literal translation. Whereas in Ace Attorney, they're like, oh, we're going to change all the characters to be more punny, and we're going to make it, more equivalent. I know there are certain hordes of gamers out there who would hate it if that was done nowadays. But that's just what stuck, and that's what's made Ace Attorney stick around so long in English. So yeah, there's definitely times where it's like, you know what, it's not worth changing everything. And especially when you're dealing with like an anime or something with the voices in Japanese, if you're hearing someone say Akiko and they're saying like, hey, Sarah Sunshine, like it's just not going to connect.
I have a question on your like personal opinion on where localization is going now compared to before. Because I feel like with Netflix and Crunchyroll, it feels like they're focusing really hard on making it very localized versus where it used to be more like you could have a sense of the original language and it really helped copy the language. But now I don't know, it feels like there's some points where it takes you out of the emotion of the experience. There's no way that they would actually say this in English.
Mm-hmm. I think on a trajectory wise, I think we are leaning more towards localized English translation, especially for subtitles. Dubbing is also leaning much in, but I would say probably I would say 10 or 15 years ago, when we're looking specifically at anime dubbing, the quality was much lower because they were trying to stay so formally equivalent. They were trying to match the grammatical structure and the rhythm, and sometimes even the voice acting of the Japanese. But Japanese voice acting, in the same way like Japanese acting, the intonation, the melodic nature of the speech is so tied to the language and to the culture that trying to recreate that in English just seems strange. Like it doesn't create an equivalent experience. I would say nowadays, there are places where they do over localize a little bit here and there. I would say overall, especially on Crunchyroll, their localization quality is really, really high right now. They're doing a very good job. I know Michelle Tymon's on there. She does Spy Family and a couple other things. Absolutely fantastic translator. As she does tend to localize a little bit more than state of the formal equivalence. But yeah, I think, when it comes to, again, creating that equivalent experience, creating the equivalent experience is so important in that we want, if it's a joke, people need to laugh. We want characters to sound like characters and not like, Google Translate spit it out. So I think that level of localization is good. Obviously, there's going to be, bumps along the way, in the same that there's always been with localization. But I think overall, the trajectory is heading more towards localization. I think another part of this, if we're looking at this in a functionalist perspective, is what is the function of a localized subtitle for watching anime. And I have heard that, multiple people say like, yeah, well, I don't like it when it's localized because it's harder for me to learn Japanese with it. And I'm going to say right now, the number one reason, what's the number one function? Why do people watch anime? It is to be entertained. We are not looking to teach people Japanese. I'm not looking to teach you what this cool new kanji puzzle is. I would love to create a second subtitle track for people who are learning the language that maybe has more explicitation. I know in old fan subs of old anime, they would have the big text on screen or even at the end of the episode to explain what stuff was going on or why a joke was funny. But that's just not what we do right now. We're not trying to teach people Japanese. We are here to entertain. We're here to create that equivalent experience, which is why localization is now taking this direction.
Just kind of like, kind of extending off of what we were talking about previously about like being like absolutely like right on point with how something is in Japanese. I wanted to ask, in your experience working directly with voice actors, like whether it be on like in a booth or online or whatever, how often would you say there's like, or rather, how much room would you say there is for things like improvisation from the voice actor's part and not just like going off what the script is giving them?
Very, very, very little. I'd say the only improvisation that I've ever had in the booth is if we run into a place where it's like, oh, we need 2 more syllables in this line. It's just not working out properly. Sometimes the actor, again, will try to give their own like inspirations, like, hey, can I do this instead? But it's 99.99% of the time they say what we tell them to do. That's their job. It's the same way with like, you know, in acting, like ad-libbing might be allowed in certain places, but there's a reason the scriptwriter wrote something a certain way. There's a reason why we've adapted things a certain way. Sometimes the actor may not even like the things that they're saying. I mean, even as a translator, sometimes there's stuff I work on that I really don't like the way it is, or I don't like the way they're asking me to translate certain things or certain names. But that's just what I'm being paid to do. So yeah, to answer your question, no, there's very, very, very little opportunity to ad lib. And if they do, or if they make a little joke, we usually keep it and like play to like the company because it's kind of funny, but it never makes its way into the actual show.
I was just curious about because one of the only instances of ad libbing or what I assume is ad libbing that I know of in the anime was this one episode of Pokemon, like back in the 2000s. It was during the 4Kids era, and there was this one scene where the character Meowth is talking, and he's talking to James, the guy with like the blue hair, the M-shaped hair, and he says something like, "Don't worry, that pretty blue heady, where's it got a plant?" And then James, like his voice actor, like he says right at the end, "It's lavender," and you can see the scene cutting somewhere else while he's saying that. So it's clear that that line of dialogue wasn't in the original Japanese version, but the line not only was funny, but it absolutely makes sense in character for James. It's not like something nonsensical.
So that we're allowed to add lines that weren't necessarily in the Japanese. I've done that in a couple of different shows that I've written for. It's easier when you're doing a dub than a subtitle because it's hard to add a subtitle when you're not hearing dialogue. But when you're completely replacing the dialogue, sometimes you may, you know, completely reword or completely like if they show somebody speaking and they pan up to like the sky and like show the clouds for a couple seconds, you can completely rewrite what's being written or how it's being said or even the timing of it just because the mouth movements aren't on screen. So it's perfectly it could have been that the scriptwriter had wrote that in for the actual actor to read, even though it wasn't in the Japanese.
Questions? Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know how related this was. It was an example you gave about like how he was talking super fast, the guy with the big chin and everything.
Yeah.
What show was that?
That's called Tatami Galaxy. The entire show is like that.
I know the movie, but I was like, I didn't know it was a TV show.
Oh, it's a movie.
Yeah,
13 episodes of that. You would not be paid enough to translate that person. It's a lot of text.
Another question, it's kind of like he kind of reminded me of it. I don't know if you know what happened with Ghost Stories.
I feel like that's a big. There's a lot of like YouTubers and other essayists have talked about that. The long story short is it was a license they picked up on top of like they said you can't have Dragon Ball Z, but you also have to take this show. And then they just decided to have fun with it. That in itself is a localization. Obviously, they weren't going for the same target audience. So the original show was made for kids in elementary school. Then they decided to take the show and then completely redub it to be more for an adult experience. That is a translation. That is a localization with goals for a target audience. It is not an incorrect translation. It is a translation. But yeah, I feel there's a lot of people who have talked about it who know a lot more about it than I do. So definitely look it up.
Two last questions. Sorry, I can't be what I want to say. Number one, when you're working with voice actors, and I know you mentioned that you work things like phrasing or how many words you put in a sentence. I was wondering, something I always notice when listening to English anime dubs, especially modern ones, not just for anime, but like anime, video game, whatever. I always notice like very like strange like inflections. Like there are certain voice actors that I hear that a lot of their lines they like rise up and they put emphasis on like the last words in a sentence. How often would you say that like your guiding for the voice actors comes down to like nitty gritty inflections?
I would say that's probably a question better asked of a voice director. I write the lines and I can put in my own little thing like, oh, I want this to be rising at the end, or like at the very end of this line, he punches the guy in the face. So it really needs to like build up to it. But I would say that's more probably for a voice director. In the same way that like a script writer for a movie writes the script and then the director tells the actor how they want to interpret that. The same thing can go for voice actors and voice directors. I've worked with voice actors who are really good at their job, who can be super emotive, but then they go into a video game and the director kind of gives them some weird instructions. And now suddenly everyone's saying, well, this guy is such a bad voice actor. He can't do it. It sounds so bad. When in reality, the director was telling him to do the voice that way. So that would be a better question for a voice director.
Oh, that's actually a good segue to my last question. I remember when I was younger and I started noticing all these things about like all these like little things in anime dubs, I always thought it was a voice actor thing and not a voice direction thing. Especially given the fact that, you know, in all like these English dubs, you usually see like the same voice actors in it. And when you go look them up, you'll find out like that they only do dubbing. So that's what I wanted to ask. How would you consider like the backgrounds of the voice actors you work with? Like, do they have like a wide range of like dubbing work and work that was initially produced in English, or do you find yourself working with actors that only or mainly do dubbing?
I would say for most of the voice actors I work with don't just do dubbing, especially nowadays when the rent's going up, food is more expensive. They're taking on a lot more jobs. So I worked with a voice actor actually on Persona 5 who did a full character for Persona 5. And then she also did the audio description track for the blind and visually impaired for Lord of the Rings, Rings of Power. So it's her voice you hear narrating what you're seeing on screen. But again, she's just reading the ADR script that was being written by our team at Deluxe. I know people who are doing audiobooks. I know people who also do, their own podcasts. They do their own YouTubes or whatnot. But I would say most voice actors are doing a variety of different roles just within voice. I know somebody who just found out that they're like the new voice of the train in Vancouver because they've recorded a bunch of lines for a client and they ended up buying the voice pack. As people who are doing local ads in Los Angeles or up in San Francisco for mattress stores and stuff like that. So really whatever they get hired to use their voice for, they use. But yeah, I don't typically, for voice actors, we're usually hiring voice actors, not people who are not voice actors. So like we don't usually hire actors to come in on a voice acting thing because the skills are so specific.
Yeah, that was something I was wondering because.
Okay, we're gonna have to end here because we're ending the class. Okay. So Katrina, thank you so much. Really appreciate you joining us for this event. We've all, I think, learned a lot. Thank you.
No, thank you so much for having me. And feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn or shoot me an email. They've got it. If you have any more questions, always happy to answer. I am moving this weekend to Tokyo, though, so I might be a little bit slow to respond. Sorry, I'm kind of blurred to this whole mess.
Yeah. I'm jealous.
I know. Well, don't be too jealous. It's like 95 degrees and 100% humidity there right now, so.
Okay, thank you, Katrina.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. Have a great night, everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye.